Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, Can a Green Recovery Help Address Poverty? It's the fifth Poverty Alliance webinar, but it's the first one that we've done in partnership with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, so really delighted to be sharing this today with such an important and growing network of organisations. I'm sure Gemma will say a little bit more about them in a minute. The format for this morning's webinar, it's probably becoming familiar to many of you. Just to say at the start, we are recording today's webinar. I'm going to ask you to use the Q&A function throughout our discussion this morning to gather some questions, and hopefully we'll have maybe about 15 minutes or so at the end to focus on some of the key questions that come up. We're doing this webinar today in partnership with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance because it's such an important issue, and one that I think, certainly for anti-poverty organisations, that many of us, I think, need to take a much greater focus on in the future. This whole series of webinars has been about how we build back better, and the emphasis is very much on the better, so what better means. And I think the idea that we can build back better without taking into consideration the climate crisis and how that impacts on people living on low incomes already, I think is absolutely fundamentally important. So I'm not going to talk too much longer. My name is Peter Kelly. I'm Director of the Poverty Alliance, for those of you who don't know me. We've got three really excellent speakers today. I'm going to turn firstly to Gemma Bowen-Dodds, who is a board member of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, but also a director of the All-In agency as well. Gemma's going to give us an overview of the wellbeing economy and what that means before we move on to Miriam and then Ryan. So Gemma, if I could ask you to start sharing your screen, I'll stop sharing mine.
Okay, hello everybody. I shall just share that. Hopefully that is, the PowerPoint is up. So, whoops, sorry. I'm just going to set my timer because I like to make sure that I am going to be just taking the 10 minutes. So I'm Gemma. I am a board member of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in Scotland, and so I'm going to try and do three things today. The first is to talk about why the move to a wellbeing economic model is necessary, with a bit of analysis of why the current economy is not something that we should be going back to. And I'm also going to signal a few of the key, the broad key shifts that we need to be able to do that. Without going into too much detail about the propositions, because I know Miriam and Ryan have some really excellent and very practical ones, and so I want to save that space for them. So I just wanted to start by that question of why do we need to move to a wellbeing economy? And I was reflecting on this and thinking, you know, very clearly about the link with poverty. And I was just remembering, because I think it's quite easy to forget what we've all been through in the past sort of 5 months, 6 months, is I just want to remind everyone of that feeling that we had sort of early in lockdown, when we were so anxious, when we were so frightened of what was happening. And for many of us who, you know, generally are quite privileged in life, that feeling like, are we going to get enough food? We saw the photos of the supermarket shelves that were getting cleared out. We were genuinely worried about whether we were going to, you know, have enough food. Would supply chains break down? Would we actually face a real crisis of food in this country that would affect us, right? That would affect, you know, everybody. And this was new to me, and it might have also been new to people on this call, but actually that feeling is a regular occurrence for people in poverty. Uswitch did some research at the back end of last year, and there's 1.6 million people in the UK that they estimate have to regularly choose between heating their homes or eating. And this is something that is, you know, spoken out against by anti-poverty charities, but actually is kind of accepted in our system, and that's getting worse. The rise in the use of food banks, particularly over the last 10 years, has really shown that this is now an accepted part of our society. But I think also this week, or last week, the death of Mercy Baguma in Glasgow, with a little 1-year-old baby beside her, starving. This is what our economy is doing to people. This is what we consider to be acceptable these days. And that is a direct result of economic policies that serve to punish migrants and asylum seekers in particular. And this is not right. This is not a civilized country that we live in when this is what our economy delivers. Now, going back to what we've been learning in this crisis, I think just related to that lockdown, and eventually the supermarkets got refilled and we all felt a bit safer. But again, if you were really privileged like me, you could get your Tesco delivery to come in, or your organic veg box scheme or whatever. There was still this sudden and stark understanding that our most essential workers in this country are the ones who have been vilified and made to feel like they're the least essential, and those people who've literally been keeping us alive, not just our doctors and nurses, but our supermarket workers, our delivery drivers, the care workers who were stepping over the front line into a knowingly dangerous environment to care for our loved ones when we couldn't. These are the most mistreated and precarious workers. And why I believe that a wellbeing economy is one, what we need to move to, is really about this moral issue, about morally we value these kinds of workers now, and there's a real clarity about that, and that's what I think gives us a real moment to create an economy that actually value, you know, so we can economically value that which we morally and practically value, and I think that's where we need to start. So if I just take a step back, that's kind of like my sort of emotional intro to that. We can't go back to the economy that we had, even if we just sort of valued workers a little bit more, and that's for 4 reasons. So my analysis is we have a series of converging crises. So we have a social crisis. So inequality is hardwired into our economy. So the UK is the 5th most unequal country in the OECD. And in the past 5 years, the median income, so the average of everybody's income in the UK, has risen by 2.2%. However, this sort of hides over the fact that the richest 5% actually took most of that. So they had a rise in income of nearly 5%. And the poorest 1/5 of people, they actually had a fall in income of 1.6%. So not only is that equality extremely bad to start with, it's getting worse. Related to that, we're going into, well, we are in an economic crisis. We're in a recession, and I'm pretty sure that that's going to become a global depression, and there are huge challenges there. But these 2 things link into a political crisis. So I think the way the economy is currently structured is as if you have politics down here and then the economy is up here, and the economy has been treated for such a long time like it is separate to politics, right? We're not making political decisions, we're just doing what has to be done to raise GDP, or, you know, it's not political, it's just the way that business has to be. And I think we we in some sense have seen through that, but what it means is, and why it creates a political crisis, is that people rightly recognise that they do not have control over those decisions that most affect their lives. And I think that the problems and the outcomes of that is we see a huge rise in nationalism, and we see a huge rise in racism. And those things are used as scapegoats to take, you know, political power and kind of ignore the sort of economic root causes of that. And then obviously the final thing is the environmental challenge, so the climate and biodiversity crisis. I loved this cartoon, and I'm sure many of you will have seen. And, you know, any solutions for recovery that come out need to look forward into the future, and they need to take a realistic account of the world that we find ourselves in. So climate change is something that is, at a bare minimum, has to be at the root of everything that we do in terms of recovery. Otherwise, all of those existing problems that we have are going to be made worse. People who are poor are going to be least able to be able to respond to climate change, but also, and I think what we're gonna see in this seminar is that actually the actions that we should be taking to fight climate change should also be hand in hand, step in step with making progress on social issues, which takes me to this was another cartoon that I really like. What is a wellbeing economy? So I'm going to link in the chat a couple of papers if anybody wants to read up in a bit more depth about this. But a wellbeing economy, in short, is about achieving and explicitly designing the economy to create social justice on a healthy planet. And if anybody's come across the donut economics model, there's quite a few articles and things like that about it, but they have that donut economics very much sits within a wellbeing. It's a different tool, and it's a tool and method we can use to do it, where you have a social floor where we basically say nobody should fall below this, and so you need to have adequate safety nets and social systems and foundational economy to deliver that. But also there is an ecological limit to what we should be doing, and I think that what's in between those two is this social justice on a healthy planet, and that is what We All Alliance and We All Scotland are trying to do, is to try and help and support the policies and the practices and the theories that can help us get into that space. We surveyed our membership, and in sort of a bit more detail, the core elements are around these 5 things. So we all need connection, so a sense of belonging in institutions that serve the common good. We need to have participation, so we need to have that, like some people call it economic democracy, but I think it's just about being involved in the things that are important to you and having a say in your local economies in particular, but also the national. We all need nature. I think lockdown also really showed this to us. We also need fairness, so this is where the inequality piece comes in, that at a base the economy needs to be fair, and we all need dignity, and dignity and poverty and fairness and poverty and connection and participation in nature, these all connect with poverty and with climate change. And so how do we do that? So we talk about in Wellbeing Economy Alliance getting the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. So there are 2 ways to think about economic interventions. So one is downstream, what we sort of talk about as downstream economic interventions. So this is where we intervene in trying to solve or ameliorate the problems that the economy causes by the way that it functions. So things like tax credits, okay, which allow, you know, poverty paying employers to get away with paying poverty wages, and the state has to top that up in order to make it a reasonable income for people. That's an example of that, and that's Downstream. And I think the Joseph Rowntree Foundation worked out that we actually pay around £78 billion a year in this failure demand, which just specifically linked to poverty. So by not fixing the economic system further upstream, where we look at the root causes of this and we try and change the structure so that you aren't having to solve problems downstream. Because remember, if we are trying to solve you know, the real problems that exist further downstream by just, you know, putting sticking plasters over it, not only does it cost more money, which I'm almost less bothered about, it involves a huge amount of human tragedy and sacrifice. And again, we're not a civilized country if that's what we accept as normal. And so to get the economy to do more of the heavy lifting, we want to move our interventions upstream. We want to tackle those root and systemic causes. So that's via things like pre-distribution. So this is the idea of having work and having income up front that's enough and has that fairness and dignity for people to be able to live and survive on, and thrive on. Actually, I should say it's not just about survival, although that would be a huge step forward. So things like having more worker co-ops and having a much fairer share of profits and wages for people. Economic democracy. So yesterday I was at Economic Development Association Scotland event with Gary Gillespie, who's the chief economist for the Scottish Government, and that was around We All Global are creating a participatory policy making guide for policymakers to be able to centre people and stakeholders with an interest in the economic policies that they're trying to create, and really help to support to shift that so that economic democracy is at the foundation of creating policies that fit in a wellbeing economy. We've got the community wealth building, which I think we'll hear about later, purpose-led businesses. There's some fantastic examples. I'll link the Linwood case study in the chat as well, and things like full cost accounting, which takes notice of the full cost of operation of businesses rather than the state ending up having to pick that up later on. So in terms of what we need for the final few seconds is, I think this has to be about systems change. Wellbeing isn't about like yoga and candles. This is about changing the fundamental structures of the system. And so there's ideas around super policies that Jen Wallace from the Carnegie Trust has written a fantastic blog on. I'll link that in the chat as well. And these basically are policies that I think we're going to hear from Miriam as well, where if you invest in climate policy and things like retrofitting of buildings, you create jobs, you create income, you ideally through worker cooperatives and things like that, you make houses warmer, which makes people healthier, and you create greater economic resilience for people, because they're paying less in energy. So you would be working on that heating versus eating thing straight away. So a super policy, there is loads and loads and loads of opportunities to do this. We need courage. So I think in Scotland we have so much good, like we have won the argument around wellbeing economy in rhetoric in Scotland, but what we need is the courage to go further and faster and actually put our money where our mouth is. And I think that also includes having a more diverse set of people who would actually implement those policies. Benny Higgins. Clear priorities, and basically we're going to have vast amounts being spent over the next few years on economic recovery, so we need this streamlined, cohesive approach to this so that, you know, one policy doesn't contradict another. And so that's me. Sorry I went over by a little minute there, but thank you all.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Really tons in that presentation. I particularly liked the briefest of mentions of the Economic Recovery Advisory Group there. We'll maybe come back to that in the Q&A. And I would just remind all of our participants just ask any questions. I know Gemma's going to fill up the chat with references to some of the documents that she talked about, but please come forward with your questions. I'm going to turn now to Miriam. So Miriam, if you would like to share your screen now.
That working yet?
That's working. Not yet.
No, I feel it might have the same issue as the last one. Did Peter, would it be okay to share my presentation? Sorry.
I will do that, yeah.
Thank you. Should I just give you a shout when it's ready to go to the next one? Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's absolutely brilliant to be here and to sit alongside such powerhouse voices. Fantastic. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about some of the kind of policy direction of travel that we could take in Scotland in the immediate future. I want to start off, if we can just turn to the first slide there, the second one rather. Yeah, perfect. Speaking a little bit about what the pandemic has done in terms of exposing some of the fractures that have actually been embedded in our economy for a long time now. So I think it's important to recognise kind of the context in which we saw this crisis arrive. We had a decade of austerity that had seen 10 years of lost real wage growth for workers in the UK. We had stagnating living conditions, declining investment, soaring levels of hunger, and rising child poverty. And we had struggles in our economy on top of that as well, through a kind of disproportionate reliance on consumption-led growth, for example, household and private debt, rising low levels of investment and waning productivity and high levels of inequality. So we didn't go into this crisis with a strong, resilient economy. We went into this crisis with an economy that was very fractured, that was very divided, that was very broken, that wasn't working for a lot of people to begin with. And I think that's an important context just to set this discussion in. So COVID has exposed fractures in our economy that long predate this crisis. So while the virus itself may not discriminate, our economy does discriminate. And those who were already marginalised, oppressed, vulnerable structurally in our economy are shouldering the cost of this crisis. And we've seen that through the disproportionate way in which working class and Black, Asian and ethnic minority people have been hit by this crisis. And while the government intervention remains really vital, what we have seen as well is that much of the state support provided to people, to communities, to households, has flowed to rentiers. That's looking at those who do not profit from productive work, but instead profit from ownership of resources. So an example of that is an IPPR report which found that 45% of the net cost of the UK government's furlough scheme over the first 3 months was spent on rent and debt repayments. That effectively shields and insulates the wealth of those already wealthy. And that matters because just now, if we turn we're all right just now actually, because we're heading into a very severe crisis at the moment, and unless action is taken, we're going to see a replication of mistakes of the past where the poorest are going to suffer again as the crisis really takes grip. So great, onto that slide there. So joining the dots, looking at how our unequal and extractive economy is fueling climate breakdown. Now for me, the climate crisis really changes everything, not least because it has a deadline and there's no going back after that. So while COVID is our immediate focus, climate breakdown and biodiversity loss are the biggest threats facing our future. Now the world is off track to meet the well below 2 degree limit set as part of the climate, as part of the Paris Agreement. And even if we did meet that, even if states met their individual targets, we'd still be on track for extremely dangerous levels of warming. So importantly here, and as part of this discussion, the climate crisis is inherently linked to soaring levels of inequality. The causes and distributional impacts of the climate crisis are unevenly felt, and that's why it matters as part of a class analysis. That's why it matters as part of poverty alleviation. And those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are disproportionately paying the price for it. So if we look at the UK context, for example, 70% of international flights in Britain are taken by just 15% of the population. Globally, we see the wealthiest 1% of the population consuming around 175 times more carbon than someone from the poorest 10%. So there's a real imbalance in consumption when we look at class lines here. So the climate crisis is also a crisis of inequality. The poor that have done the least to drive this are also most vulnerable to its impacts as well. So when we talk about confronting the climate emergency and having an effective and just recovery, we need to recognise that our environmental and climate fights share a common cause with our economic fights, and to me at the heart of this is an extractive and unequal economic model, and moving forward we need to address these as one. Next slide please. Great, so what's coming ahead? Well, the COVID-19 economic fallout is predicted to plunge our economy into the deepest recession in 3 centuries. Now how we choose to respond to this crisis will be a test as to whether lessons have been learned from the last financial crisis. And the impact will be felt hardest on those who are struggling already unless action is taken to protect them. I think what's becoming increasingly clear, and alluding to what Gemma was speaking about, is that the current growth model is not fit for purpose. And now in a Scottish context, while there are limitations to how far the Scottish Government can go to wholly transform the economy at a kind of very macro systemic level under the current devolution settlement, measures can be taken to bring about and facilitate that transformation. And I think here, just as the current model centres on a particular type of economic model that is extractive, that is financialised, that is rooted in inequality and climate breakdown, a new economic consensus can really lay the foundations for a much more equitable, sustainable and democratic system of economy that is based on common and democratic ownership. So next slide, please. Thank you. So this week, myself and Laurie McFarlane, who's a Scottish economist, published a report by Commonwealth setting out a just and sustainable path for Scotland through 6 key pillars. So I'm just going to talk through, do a whistle-stop tour of some of our headline policy recommendations. I think it's important to have a caveat here that without a large fiscal stimulus package in Westminster or greater powers, borrowing powers in Scotland, there are limitations to introducing all of these policies at once. The hope of this paper is to just generate some really fresh ideas around what the kind of type of transformation that Scotland's economy needs and what we could deliver over the long term. So this is going to be a phased ongoing process that will need to be kind of set out as such. It's not it won't be a quick fix in that regard. Nevertheless, the first key pillar is a green and just recovery. I'm sure you'll be unsurprised to hear. So for a sustainable future, Scotland needs a raft of well-paid, secure, sustainable employment opportunities. It was really encouraging to see the advisory group's report on a job guarantee and looking at kind of a job guarantee to kind of bolster security there. But the business-led approach, which was the one that was advocated, could actually hamper the development of that. So if we're looking at the fact that businesses are struggling just now, we're seeing diminished demand, we're seeing depleted kind of slush funds for businesses as well. Are they likely to bring on a host of new jobs, even if they are subsidised, given the level of distress that so many businesses are currently under? And importantly, what kind of jobs are they going to be? Are they going to be secure jobs? Are they going to be decent jobs? Are they going to be unionised jobs? So instead, what we've advocated is a Scottish job guarantee that could be designed to provide well-paid, secure employment opportunities in the public sector for anyone who needs it, focusing on priorities, again, meeting those twin goals of climate justice and economic justice in areas like decarbonising the housing stock, building a new generation of social homes, supporting nature restoration and restoring peatlands, for example. Second to this component is the delivery of a Green New Deal. I think this is kind of just so macro in its focus and really needs to stretch to every element of our economy. So it's looking at kind of breaking from a model of unsustainable forms of production and consumption. And that's about supporting a job-led just transition, looking at kind of really scaling up renewable energy, for example, looking at what we could do with a publicly owned energy company and investing in a renewable generation as well as energy supply, retrofitting of homes, and also looking at reforms to our taxation system that meet the twin goals of climate and economic justice, like introducing a frequent flyer levy, for example. So the second key pillar that we looked at is community wealth building. Now, the concentration of ownership of wealth and power designed into our economy has stripped workers and communities of the wealth that they create in common, and COVID has threatened the viability of so much of our local economies. At the same time as we're seeing Amazon, who last made headlines in Scotland for paying slave wages and for people living in tents outside their warehouses, advertising 100,000 new jobs, and Jeff Bezos on track to be the world's first trillionaire. So I think this is a concerning direction of travel, and for me, community wealth building provides a really nice kind of antidote to the kind of further concentration, the exploitation, the extractive nature of our economy. It's really about supporting an economic strategy where that transfers financial and physical assets to local communities and really redirects wealth, control and benefits to those local economies. So what we've recommended is the creation of a Community Wealth Building Act to support local economies that's rooted in CLES's 5 pillars of community wealth building, which are pluralist models of business ownership, looking at supporting cooperatives, social enterprises, worker-owned businesses, for example, making financial power work for local places. How do we feed the lifeblood of local economies? Fair employment and just labour practices, progressive procurement of goods and services, and socially just use of land and property. So the third pillar is that of banking for the public good, looking at what we could do to really harness the potential of the Scottish National Investment Bank. I should say that I'm not the expert on the panel here, as Gemma's done loads of work on this. So, but what we've looked at was 2 kind of key themes within this. So really recognising that the establishment of the Scottish National Investment Bank is a massive achievement, but while its governance structure is common practice in the private sector, it's actually relatively unusual in a public sector bank. So we would look to diversify that with, for example, ministerial representation, trade union, local authorities, civil society, organisational representation on the board, and importantly a cap on the number of private sector board members as part of the Scottish National Investment Bank. The second kind of pillar that we look at with enhancing the Scottish National Investment Bank is looking at creating a holding company arm of it that would basically be kind of recognising that a lot of businesses that are under very acute distress just now would be tasked with purchasing equity stakes in distressed but otherwise viable Scottish businesses that meet a defined criteria, effectively helping them to stay solvent throughout the COVID crisis. The next pillar is that of tenant protection and social housing. So we've actually seen some really important progress on enhancing security of tenure for private rental in the private rental sector in Scotland recently. But rents remain really high, and we continue to increase much faster than many households can afford, and that has significant impacts on living standards. So what we've argued for is a rent freeze to ensure that tenants don't face increases during the time of hardship, a system of rent controls that would commence after the freeze period ends, and supports to increase social house building to secure homes for all and create jobs. The next pillar is that of securing democratic public ownership. Now, over the last 4 decades, privatisation has been an incredibly prominent component of the UK's very unequal and extractive economic model. And we've seen important steps to challenge this in Scotland. So, for example, the abolition of the right to buy, which sold off nearly 500,000 council homes in Scotland, was a meaningful moment because that was such a pillar of what Thatcherism was and what it stood for. So to turn that around was significant. But I think there means a need to kind of harness this by shifting our understanding of our approach to democratic ownership away from a patchwork of really good individual policies and towards a strategy of integrating democratic public ownership at the heart of a comprehensive and planned transition to a new economy with well-being at its core. And we can see that particularly acutely in this crisis in areas like transport and the care sector. My final pillar is that of stewarding land. So land reform has been one of the kind of crowning achievements of the Scottish Parliament. Maybe I'm just a biased rural Scottish person, but it's important that this is seen as not as a one-off, but rather an ongoing process, because Scotland's land remains incredibly concentrated. So it's estimated that half of Scotland's rural land is owned by just 432 people. That's astounding. And we're seeing communities, talking of Mr. Higgins, having to raise millions of pounds to purchase land, which in the case of the Buccleuch estate was gifted for free to landed gentry class who now stash their wealth in tax havens. That to me speaks to the imbalance of power when it comes to land, and that's so imperative when it's speaking about kind of community empowerment, community ownership, a stake in say in our economy, but also our climate goals as well. We need to reconsider Scotland's land use. Grousemires being a fantastic example of exactly that. What could that land be used for? Could that land be used for forests? Could that land be used for rewilding? Could that land be used for creating jobs to bring about all of these? So what we've advocated is measures such as the establishment of a democratically accountable Scottish Land Development Agency that could purchase, develop and sell land and ensure that that's a key resource is being managed strategically in the public interest, as well as enhancing community right to buy and introducing an upper limit on the amount of land in Scotland that could be held by a private landowner or beneficial interest, as well as compulsory sale orders for local authorities. So I'll leave it up there, but I think we're battling an incredible time of uncertainty and upheaval, and we face an economic crisis, we face an inequality crisis, we face a climate crisis, and now really is the time for bold action and big thinking. So for me, that's about fundamentally shifting how our economy operates, whose interests does it operate in, and about laying the foundations for a more equitable, sustainable and democratic economy.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Again, just full of ideas and proposals for change. And I think what we want to do now is move on to our final speaker, Ryan Morrison from Friends of the Earth Scotland, who's going to talk about some of the action that's already been undertaken, some of the campaigning that's already been undertaken, and the rationale for that campaigning around a just and green recovery. So Ryan, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Sorry, I'll just get this working. Hopefully that's all fine for you all now. Start a timer as well, just to be safe. Yeah, so thanks, Peter. I work on just transition for Friends of the Earth Scotland, and I guess I want to start by talking a bit about what that means, and then bringing in some of our work on just and green recovery. And I guess put as simply as I can, really, just transition is about recognising the need to shift away from a polluting economy, and in the process protecting the existing workforce and making that economy fairer, recognising those injustices that we've heard from Gemma and Miriam. It rests on one key principle, and that's that whether internationally or domestically, the impacts of the climate crisis are felt disproportionately by those who are already most vulnerable and who have made the least contribution. And in terms of responsibility for those crises, we know that it is the wealthiest and most powerful who have contributed the most. And I think that probably must feel familiar for lots of you working in anti-poverty, because it's similarly true of social justice, that you must find yourself infuriated as people who have to deal with and live with the real impacts of poverty are ignored by those who sort of set the rules and benefit from the way things are structured today. Miriam already mentioned this, but I'm just going to bring up that, again, that Jeff Bezos of Amazon is predicted to become the world's first trillionaire by 2026. That's a little over 5 years away. That's 12 zeros, which is pretty hard to grasp. And at the same time, the news yesterday coming from England was about politicians defending giving people £13 a day to live on for the lowest paid workers while they self-isolate and can't work. And it just, these sort of conversations that we're having, that these two things can happen in parallel without there being a huge level of intervention, a huge level of change, or a recognition that something really structural is going wrong, just speaks to the sort of the real madness of it all. And I think our work on just transition is really recognising the cause of these injustices are really rooted in the same place. And so we've heard a bit about that already, that our lives and our economy today are designed largely around the pursuit of economic growth, and that's enabling huge individual and corporate accumulation and exploitation to make that happen. And so we're living in a system which is taking us to the brink of climate breakdown, but it is also enabling the growth of precarious work, the weakening of workplace rights, and the huge social inequalities that we see. 25% of people in Scotland live in fuel poverty, for example. And so to solve the massive challenges that we're facing, and then to embed justice for the future, to make that future-proof, we need to sort of reset the scales and redesign what we're dealing with, our economy, and put people and planet at its heart as the priority. And so that, for me and for our just transition work, that means if we're tackling the root causes of the climate crisis, we'll also be tackling the root causes of social injustice and vice versa. And so that's what we're really building on. And specifically, that work has focused on, for us, workers in communities who are most dependent on fossil fuel intensive industries. We know they're most at risk from the transition away from fossil fuels. And our Sea Change report that we co-authored had mapped how you could move to 100% renewable, meeting our energy needs with 100% renewable energy, while creating 3 times as many jobs for those in the industry. And that came with a demand for a commitment to equivalent work for people in the industry, and also for the other work that's created to be on decent terms, fair work, recognised trade union involvement, to try and address some of the poverty challenges we have. And so we've heard from the UN's climate scientists that the pace and scale of change needed to tackle the climate crisis is unprecedented. And so in that, there is a massive opportunity to create skilled, secure work at a time when it's sorely needed. But rather than that, what we've actually seen over the last few years, over the last decade or so, is that the gig economy has grown rapidly. Precarious and usually poorly paid employment has risen. In-work poverty is on the rise in Scotland from about 40% 20 years ago to about 65% now. And so we've grown our renewable energy capacity, but completely failed to capture the decent skilled work that was needed to make it happen, while increasing our dependence on insecure work and insecure sectors of the economy. So we had promised job numbers from the Scottish Government in the low carbon and renewable economy of around 28,000 by 2020. That number is 1,700 today and has actually declined in the last year, which is pretty hard to believe when you hear all the conversation about climate emergency and things like that, that figure is falling. And I've just given 2 examples here of where we can kind of see this failure of industrial strategy, this failure to capture the benefits playing out. And that's in CS Wind, in Campbelltown and Argyll. CS Wind is the UK's only manufacturer of offshore and onshore wind turbine towers. And then on the right is a bus made by Alexander Dennis, which is the UK's largest coach and bus manufacturer. And the site in CS Wind is effectively mothballed just now. The site's basically been shut down, and that's despite receiving really significant public subsidies to deliver projects. Jobs have been lost there already. While Alexander Dennis announced recently, and this felt like it's been in the pipeline for a while, that they're going to cut 650 jobs across the UK, including in Falkirk, where many think the work is going to be sent to Turkey instead. And so the important thing here to try and sort of bring that back into this conversation about poverty is that we are seeing a rise of in-work poverty because we've seen a rise in insecure, precarious work rather than a rise of quality work that provides good terms and decent skills and like a really valuable opportunity. And I think what our just transition work is about is saying that in the move to a fossil-free economy, we have the chance to create that. We're missing those chances now, but we can solve climate and social injustice if we tackle the root causes of them to address that. If we can, as Gemma and Miriam have said as well, if we can put well-being and people and planet at the top of the pile. And I think that really brings me on to the work we've been doing at Friends of the Earth with loads of others around a just and green recovery from the economic impacts of COVID. And so it was a really sudden and unexpected crisis, and so soon after the 2008 financial crash, a decade of austerity, and in the middle of hugely raised attention to the climate crisis, it felt really quickly that there needed to be a strong response to say we couldn't just keep doing the same old things, that the sort of response we had in 2008 wasn't going to cut it. And I think that was felt by loads of people too, not just in our organisation or other organisations. And I guess, like as I think we hear quite a lot about, that it was partly because it was impossible not to see the dynamics of injustice playing out with coronavirus. You know, it was those in the gig economy or key workers, it was those in the gig economy who were abandoned, and that became very clear when furlough scheme wouldn't protect self-employed people, and then when you had key workers who were risking their lives, you know, that was universal. We all seen that, and I think people were far more aware that if they were able to work from home, quite safe and secure relatively, then they were relying on people who couldn't do that and putting themselves at risk to keep things, the basics, moving. And so those values of just transition, where we are recognising the unequal contribution to crisis and the unequal impacts that come from them, are like immediately visible again. And so those solutions and that conversation about prioritising people and planet really just is crucial. It is imperative to that conversation as well. And so it felt for us like the moment to work with people who we maybe crossed paths with on specific policies, but we maybe hadn't done any big all-encompassing campaigning that brought a range of interests together. And so we and others reached out to organisations and ended up with 82 groups across civil society, including trade unions, environmentalists, anti-poverty groups like Poverty Alliance, and faith groups, community groups, and more, meeting together to try and build a plan that we could all get behind, that could tackle the root causes and set us on a far more secure and resilient course. And I think this was really different from the usual. I think we might often find ourselves coming together around a common issue. This was coming together at a common moment. You know, this was people who maybe hadn't spoke about certain areas of policy agreeing to do that because the moment demanded it and the challenge demanded it. And I think that was a really powerful thing to happen. And so I want to talk a bit about what some of those policies look like, and I've given a sort of brief summary of them on the slide, but I'll kind of talk through a few of what the specifics of that are. And so at the first point here is about providing essential public services for people and not for profit. And when we have worked on that together, we've worked on expanding the public ownership of public services to embed a people first priority, as well as boosting investment, including in social care, strengthening the NHS and our education, and building zero carbon social and cooperative housing to deal with the housing crisis at the same time. The second point here about protecting marginalised people and those on low incomes by distributing wealth really looks at what happened after the 2008 financial crash. We provided support to companies and executives, and that money filtered away. And I think as I think it was Miriam that pointed out that 45% of the furlough scheme going immediately to rent and debt payments. That's just difficult to conceive. And so we want to see bailouts or support given to people and income prioritised for those who need it most rather than for shareholders. We want to see raised taxes on the wealthy. and ensuring that all public sector workers receive at least the real living wage. And then also to try and improve the situation, to try and tackle some of the precarity of work, improving workers' rights and health and safety policies, giving people a greater role for their trade union and greater engagement in those processes, rather than some of the sort of restrictive legislation we've seen. And the third point here is about providing new funds to meet our fair share of climate emissions and to enhance biodiversity. And that's some of the things I was going to be talking about when I was introducing Just Transition, but it's also looking at creating and protecting jobs in sustainable travel, renewable heat and affordable local food and energy efficiency, as well as bringing in those green employment opportunities for young people, with retraining for those who are in polluting industries now that maybe need to transition to something new. The fourth point here is about strengthening democracy and human rights during crises, and that was a recognition that as coronavirus hit, there was a real increase in sort of surveillance and police powers, and this ask was about actually we need to be committed to repealing those as soon as is possible, and then looking more long term, enabling full scrutiny of planning and policy decisions, creating an independent recovery commission founded on participatory democracy. You know, it's not just a type of commission that will maybe invite you in to talk to them once and you'll never know if they listen to you. Actually, it's the people who are going to be affected by decisions being in the room, making those decisions themselves, because people have a right to direct their own futures and their own livelihoods. And then introducing fundamental human rights into Scots law so that the safety nets are always in place for the most vulnerable, and that those can be challenged if anything is going wrong. And then the final point is about solidarity across borders, and that's making sure we're keeping an eye on the international as well, and it's particularly important for climate crisis when we talk about that. But again, with coronavirus, we're seeing that too. So that was about proactively supporting an international coronavirus and climate emergency response that would challenge the scapegoating of migrants and would bolster global public health and ensuring that there was equitable access to any COVID treatment in the future. So these are some of the big asks that we've been working on, and I think what really strikes me when I look at this, and I hope that strikes you too, is that the reasoning behind these asks share a common cause, even if they touch on a really broad range of subjects. Like, it's not traditional for Friends of the Earth to be advocating for all these policies, and I'm sure it's not traditional for Poverty Alliance to be doing the same, but like the moment demanded it, and there's a wider recognition that the solutions here are far bigger, and I think we've heard a lot of that from Gemma and Miriam too. And I'll just move on to my last slide, and that really, I just want to finish off by saying that I think this is the exciting part of this now, is that we are still working together. So pulling those asks together and sending those policies away has been the first step, and we're now learning from others, learning from each other, and learning from the work of people like Commonwealth. And so when it comes to, as the title of the webinar was, like asking how can a green recover tackle poverty, I think it's really about this sort of work and about what we're trying to do, which is that we need to make the case for like a resetting of the scales, like a rewriting of priorities and a reimagining of what our economy is for, what purpose does it serve, who does it serve, and finally putting people and planet at the start of that, because if we don't do that now, then the risks of climate crisis are immense, and we will be, rather than building any sort of security coming out of this crisis, we'll just be steering towards another one. And that will then play out the same sort of disproportionate impacts on people who are already vulnerable that we've seen now. And so what I'd like to end with specifically is that there are ways that you can get involved, and I really hope that you do. I'll send a couple of links in, but the programme for government from the Scottish Government is expected quite soon. It's a huge opportunity for the Scottish Government to lay out what it will do in the next 12 months. This is a crucial 12 months if we're going to see a just and green recovery. And so we're asking Nicola Sturgeon to make that commitment now, to lay the foundations so that we can fully capture the green jobs opportunity that's here as part of an economic growth, and we are going to send that letter to her ahead of the programme for government. But also in a sort of a longer term sense, we we want this to be something people are actively involved in. And so we've got some resources on our website, on the People Power Network, where you can find ways to get in touch with us, guides to help you campaign, guide references about the campaign, and really so that we can all do that together. And I can send a link into that as well. And yeah, I guess I think it'll take all of us, but I think the fact that we're all working together like this is a pretty positive step towards an answer to climate crisis and a green recovery that is socially just too. I think they have to go hand in hand. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Again, another really excellent contribution. I think one of the things that a lot of phrases that struck me in Ryan's presentation was the idea that the moment, this current moment that we're in, demands a different approach. And I think we've had very clearly an outline from all three speakers what that different approach might look like. We've had a lot of questions. Miriam and Ryan, you can put your cameras back on, let the audience see us. They are out there. So we've had a lot of questions and we're trying to bring them together. We've not got much time for chat, but we'll maybe run on maybe another 5 or 10 minutes just to allow us to explore some of them. And we're trying to pull those questions together and to get some commonality amongst them. But one thing that I wanted to start off with, which is maybe something that hasn't been raised so far, and that perhaps some of the critics of the kind of approaches that we're proposing here would say is that, well, one of the things that we need if we're going to tackle poverty is we need growth in our economy, and without that growth, then our efforts to try and tackle poverty are going to come to naught. So how would you, because some of the questions that we've got is how do we get people to change a way of thinking? How do we get them to think differently about questions about neoliberalism and capitalism? But that question about growth, how do we respond to that? Who would like to go first?
I'll maybe jump in there just quickly. So people may have known there was an article written by the chair of the Recovery Commission, which was talking and saying, but a wellbeing economy needs to deliver growth. So we at Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland did a blog, which I have linked to, which basically is around this myth of green growth in particular. So to answer that question really, really briefly, growth, we've been having growth for the past 20, 30 years and people's lives have not been getting better. I think it's safe to say we've tried that experiment of just going for growth and hoping that it will improve our lives. It hasn't been. So our point in Wales Scotland is, when we talk about growth, what kind of growth and for whom does that support? What is the growth for? What is the purpose of it? Even, Nicola Sturgeon in a TED talk says, growth should be a means and not an end. But I don't think that culturally we've understood that, and sort of that the people tasked with these things don't quite understand that difference of what that means. So in a wellbeing economy, we very much need growth in some things, right? So the kinds of interventions that Miriam and Ryan have outlined, we need growth in renewable energy, we need growth in community businesses, we need growth in lots of different types of things that are aimed at providing what we need. But we also need to degrow other activities that are harming us, okay? And it's not about just growth. We have to get away from these really binary kind of understandings of things. So that's kind of the main point that I wanted to make on that growth question.
Miriam, Ryan, do you want to come back on that just quickly before we move on?
Yeah, just really quick. I mean, just to echo everything that Jam has said, I think to add to that as well, kind of a lot of the understanding around growth and what economic growth means is rooted in a kind of trickle-down theory of that, everybody will benefit from this if everything grows. And we see that in the company, we see that in the economy more broadly, we see that in companies as well. If companies grow, they create jobs, everybody benefits, they invest. But actually what we see is this shoring up of wealth. We see excessive shareholder payouts, dividends, dividend buybacks, excessive CEO pay. We see a squeeze in the wages of people at the bottom of those firms. Now, for me, that's quite indicative of the way in which the drive for growth has actually kind of the way in which it's shaped our economy more broadly. And I think it's really about where it's situated and how it's prioritised, as well as kind of who it impacts and what's growing. It's also about what kind of value system we want to have in our economy, because actually, you know, with the pandemic as well, we've seen that you know, of course, the GDP figures are looking really bad just now, and I think it's important to kind of contextualise that and saying, well, what do they represent? For me, GDP is really good at calculating GDP. It is not really good at calculating how sustainable our economy is. It is not good at assessing levels of inequality in our economy. It is not good at calculating whether we are on track for a just transition that can give us an economy of the future. Now, all of those aspects are absolutely central to an imperative for the creation of a resilient, strong economy for going into the future, and it does not encapsulate any of them. So the notion that we would orientate our key economic kind of indicator of success around something that fails to encapsulate so many aspects of our economy is nonsensical. So yeah, it's about why are we driving for that particular model? Who's benefiting from that? What it doesn't encapsulate, and how then we go about measuring economic success through a kind of new value system that actually values equity, that actually value a kind of equitable future, that actually values sustainability, that values public health.
Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, I think I'll just sort of add an example of where this sort of a growth only focus in sort of economic and financial systems really has some bizarre consequences that are difficult to fight back against. And if you look at pension funds, which are a huge source of investment globally in the economy, you have a real difficulty in, people have been campaigning around this for years now, in trying to pull investments within pension funds away from fossil fuels and towards green industry. And one of the reasons for that is that, according to fiduciary duties, that's too big a risk. So fossil fuel investments are a known quantity where you can get a short-term growth buck, but for some reason, the idea that moving to green industry, which is so essential for the things we're talking about here, is too big a risk, which is sort of counterintuitive when you think about it. You would imagine the sort of sustainable industries of the future would be far less a risk for that kind of long-term lending. But this growth-only focus really manifests itself in bizarre ways that really, when you think about what the real priorities for people are, wouldn't be the same decision we would make. And I think it's just to try and sort of give an example of where that plays out and why it's so difficult to, and why that growth-only focus is just, yeah, bizarre. The article was bizarre.
Yeah. If I could maybe, because we have got a lot of questions, and I've realised I've diverted us away from the questions, but one of the points that I think all three of you mentioned was the importance of the forms of economic activity and participation in that. And one of the questions that came up was how do citizens actually become, how do people actually become involved in that element of economic democracy? What are some of the tangible things that need to change to bring that more democratic form of economy about? Miriam, I don't know if maybe that's your wheelhouse. Maybe you want to go first then.
Yeah. So I think the first is, you know, we've seen kind of two seismic shifts in terms of levels of ownership in our economy and living memory. The first being after World War II, when we saw this incredible expansion, investment in areas like housing and infrastructure and a welfare state in our NHS. We're still benefiting from that today. Now, that was a kind of massive expansion in terms of giving people a stake and say in the type of economy that we have. The second transition that we saw was during the Thatcher years, when we saw the rollout of privatisation, of deregulation, when we saw the normalisation of austerity. What that is a systematic rollback of the state, and therefore us, and our level of participation in that economy. So I think at a macro level, we need to see another shift, another radical shift. I think that's an absolute necessity, particularly kind of joining the fight for climate justice with the fight for economic justice and integrating that in as part of a kind of strategy for common and democratic ownership in our economy. That's essential. We've seen even the Financial Times come out and back a kind of new, a new kind of settlement, a new kind of social contract. And a very different role that the state should play, and therefore us should play in our economy. I think that's one way in which we can participate in that. We also need to go further, looking at kind of democratising firms, for example, board representation, looking at inclusive ownership funds, looking at a social wealth fund, and looking at kind of the creation of more national investment banks, for example. There's loads of ways in which we can kind of democratise our economy. I think at a kind of economic policy level, there's a real need for an enhanced social partnership, of bringing in the voices of unions, of bringing in voices of civil society representatives, of bringing in people who are directly impacted by some of the most adverse consequences of our current economic structure, and bringing them into the room in a meaningful way to help create a new economy that works for everyone. We cannot leave this up to suited men who are perceived as trusted. Actually, this is about bringing a diversity of voices and experiences and knowledge into the room, coming together to look to what our economy could look like. And we've seen kind of examples of that internationally as well. I went to a talk by Naomi Klein a few years ago, and she was speaking about the development of the LEAP manifesto in Canada, and one of the things that they did was brought in oil workers and in the room with climate campaigners to speak about kind of what a sustainable future would look like. Those are the sorts of conversations that we should be having.
Gemma, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, sure. So there's three things I want to bring into that. So of course, I already mentioned the participatory policymaking guidebook that we're working on, and we're hoping to do some work with the Scottish Government on this, particularly around how to really, so you have different participation, and democracy comes on a scale. And so I think that the Scottish Government have done lots of good things in bringing people in at early stages and things like that, but it's really about the quality and how much can people shape those processes, how much has been decided beforehand, and how much do things get rolled back after some more radical propositions have been given. So I think there's hope for economic democracy in those bigger scale processes becoming more democratic, and it's absolutely necessary. But there's also a lot of opportunity for people to take back control of their local economies. So there's a fantastic example of Linwood Community Development Trust, which there's some nodding heads there. I'll put the link in the chat, but my colleague Catherine Trebek, she wrote up a case study of them, and these women are just amazing. The short story is there was the same the same model of economic development was coming and being put under the community in Linwood, and the community were like, it's not going to work, we don't want that here, this isn't the need, this is, and they were basically rolling over and ignored. But over time, they're now, have got like a £1.5 million community business. They are taking charge. They're looking at community housing. They're really shaping. They're absolute powerhouses. And it's such a good example of how economic democracy can be done at the different scales. I guess in that sense, you also have the North Ayrshire community wealth building and the interest that that's gathered in Scotland. But also there was a question sort of in the chat, if I can bring that into this, about, how do we move away from capitalism, or how do we move away from neoliberal capitalism? And so my PhD was done on the theory of a thinker called J.K. Gibson Graham, and I will link in here. They have a really practical book called Take Back the Economy, and it's a guide for people to understand all of the different forms that the economy takes, because when we think about economy, we tend to think about a really, really small section of actually what we do to work, live, survive, and that like an iceberg, we're only looking at the bit that peaks above the water, and that actually what's underneath the water, the much bigger piece, is all of the ways that we help each other. So the gift economy, how you help out your friends, and they make the point that even the chief executive of Goldman Sachs, if he was walking past you and you were fixing the underneath of the car, if you said, can you pass me that spanner, he wouldn't say, well, how much is that going to cost? You know, like we all, the majority of our lives, we act in ways that aren't, you know, aren't reduced to capitalism in that sense. And so I'll put the link in because the book is free and it's available online, and it also has a series of like work pieces that you can do. So youth groups could do this, community groups could do this, town councils, anybody could get together and do this. And actually I know that we've got somebody who's on this call, Ali, who runs works with the People's Bank of Govanhill, and they have taken this economy as iceberg model and just look at the work that they're doing. They're having these, what we might consider in like policy wonk circles, these really like advanced, you know, and we have to understand neoliberalism and fiscal policy and but they're not, they're doing it right now in Govanhill with those people. And I bet you those people in that local community just have such a rich understanding of everything that is economy that is not capitalism, because it is so much more than reducible to capitalism. So it's again not thinking in those binaries.
Thanks very much, Gemma. I am conscious that I've been a terrible chair and I've let us run over by 10 minutes, but I do want us to excuse me, to finish off maybe with two questions. One which has come up and Ryan's answered parts of through the chat and other places, but how can people get involved? How can people practically get involved? How can they transform maybe the things that they're doing to fit with this transition to a well-being economy? But also a second question, we have the programme for government coming up, I think, next week. I know, Miriam, you've just written a paper on this, but if you could, if all three of you could say briefly, what would be your top priority for that programme for government and to see out the remainder of this period of the Scottish Parliament, or maybe looking forward towards the elections next year? Just a small question for you.
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, I've shared some links in the chat for ways to get involved in adjusting recovery. There's loads of resources on there. We're also available by email. Just get in touch with us if there's something you'd like to do that you're like, I'm not sure how to go about it. Then we really want to try and help make that happen however you think it should happen too. And in terms of the programme for government, I'm going to be a little bit dull and a little bit cheating by saying that, particularly from a just transition perspective, and one of the reasons why we've seen our economy shift hugely towards precarity and insecure and poorly paid work is because of a failure of sort of industrial strategy, a failure to really be prepared to go, what do we want this to look like and how are we going to make that happen? And what we need is a lot of really foundationary things to happen quickly. We need to know what skills we need to know what investment is needed, we need to know where the most disadvantaged communities are so that we can strategically place those things. So that's a lot of things, but I would like there to be a proper industrial strategy that is gearing us up to take advantage of the benefits that are coming and managing the risks. And I'm going to slightly answer the last question just by saying that must involve people, because it can't be just unless people are involved. You can't deliver justice top down. That's not possible. So people should be actively involved in a very meaningful way in setting that kind of strategy.
Miriam, would you like to have a crack?
Will do. Yeah, I think just to touch on that, I mean, there's no shortage of incredible campaigns to get involved in, so at like quite a grassroots level. I think in terms of kind of demands on decision makers, I think being loud and bold about our expectations just now is so important, not just in Scotland, I think everywhere. So that on participation, I mean, I think lastly, we're hosting COP next year. That is such an incredible kind of meaningful landmark moment for us as a country about kind of where we're going. That's an opportunity to put ourselves on the map. And I think kind of the kind of mobilisation around that and the kind of policy dialogue that should bring about will hopefully be very kind of invigorating. On the programme for government, yeah, I mean, I'm going to totally cheat here, but no, I think I outlined our kind of key policy priorities. So I think it's really about reimagining a new value system in our economy going forward. And I think also because of the scale of the climate crisis, because we've had 40 years of an unequal and extractive economic model, it's about kind of big thinking in the longer term and asking, having as a starter point, asking kind of what kind of economy do we want to live in? What kind of society do we want to live in? What are the actual goals that we want to have there? Because I think we've kind of got that in Scotland already. We've got a really good kind of narrative around kind of the direction of travel that we're moving in that's not so true of the narrative south of the border with the government here. But I think it's then about saying, well, like realistically, if we're getting there, like what do we need to do? What action needs to be taken, and when does that need to be taken? And to see that through, if we want to build a fairer, more equitable, more sustainable economy, what needs to happen and what role should people play in that economy? And I think at the kind of heart of that is looking at the kind of role of the state, the role of us, our role in the economy, going forward, and a real kind of marriage of those twin goals of economic and climate justice, that they should rest at the absolute heart of any decisions that are being taken just now. Hope that's not too much of a cop-out.
No, that was great, thank you. Gemma, final comments from you.
Final comment. So yeah, We All Scotland, we're here to amplify the work that's already going on, and that's fantastic in Scotland already. So I would again just say, you know, follow us on Twitter, join the Just and Green recovery, watch what Commonwealth will be doing, and you know, take a look at that Take Back the Economy guide, see if you can have some conversations about it. You know, learn up yourselves about what's important to you. Don't feel like you need to go back and start with Adam Smith. Start with your life, work up from there. Where are the opportunities and places and spaces where you can have those conversations? Because you'll be surprised at, you know, what one person can change sometimes. And in terms of the programme for government, so yeah, I mean, if they could just turn around and just do, you know, what Miriam and Laurie have outlined, I would be super pleased. But I really what I need to see next week is some concrete large-scale investment into green, you know, energy efficiency programs or green energy generation programs that are specifically targeted at helping the worst first and the worst off first, and that they won't be set up in a way that they're just going to go to big suppliers, that there is scope for the community wealth building aspect of like public procurement done well and done fairly, and that's what I really need to see. I don't want to just see another load of commissions working things out. Like, we just got to do it. Just put your money in, start a program, use an action learning process, learn from that and improve it and going forward, and obviously have people involved in that in a meaningful way.
Great. Thanks very much, Gemma. And just finally, thanks to all three of our speakers this morning. It's been fantastic. My apologies for allowing us to run over a little bit, but I think it's been worth it. And just to say to all the participants that the recording will go up on the website, and we'll endeavour to answer as many questions in a short document, and put all those links that have been shared into that document so that you've got them all. The presentations will go up on the web as well. On behalf of Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland and the Poverty Alliance, really thank you for coming along today. As Gemma has said, there are lots of different ways to get involved. Similarly with the Poverty Alliance and our work, we've got Challenge Poverty Week coming up at the beginning of October, which I would encourage you all to check out and get involved in. I think Gemma said right at the start, we've won the argument in terms of rhetoric around these issues in Scotland, but we do need to win the case in terms of the actual practical changes that we need to see. So we'll be, I think, all watching out for the programme for government next week, but we'll keep these discussions going, and thank you all again for taking part, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks all.